Hello, welcome back to Paul Wiltshire's English Treasures. Thank you for coming back. Today I'm going to be discussing a subject that I've been asked quite a bit about lately, and it is strangely pertinent to us today, and that is the Black Death. Now I'm going to split the subject into four. The first three, I'm going to talk about the disease itself and how it affected England when it first arrived here in the 14th century. And then in the fourth video, I'm going to be looking at a location that's been mentioned often in the news, and I'd like to spread the word about the remarkable story of what we call locally the Plague Village, and that's Eyam, E-Y-A-M, in Derbyshire. The plague hit that 3 centuries later in the 17th century, and I'm going to describe to you a little bit about the heroic story concerning the citizens of that little village. The Black Death. There can be no better subject on which to reflect on English history and culture. In my view, this remains the most catastrophic and significant disaster ever visited on humankind. I'm going to be looking at the effects on our ancestors and perhaps admire the English character which took the country through the horrors and the trauma and left England in actually a better shape than many other continental nations for reasons that will become apparent. I can tell you that there have been a number of pandemics in world history, and the first recorded outbreak started in Arabia around the year AD 542. We know that it reached Europe and Ireland and England, but we don't know much about the nature of that pandemic. Of course, the second and most disastrous pandemic was the Black Death, which struck Europe between the 14th and 17th centuries, and it's the original 14th century outbreak that I'm going to focus on today. First video, we'll talk about the nature of the disease itself, what it was and how it spread. The second, how it came into Europe and its movements across Europe from the Far East. And the third, we'll start to look at death tolls and the after effects of the plague. And then, as I said earlier, on the fourth, I'll move on to the remarkable Eyam village. The original outbreak of Black Death caused terror and death on a scale that was not seen again until the awful industrial scale slaughter of the First World War. I can tell you, and it may surprise you to know, that this is not an extinct disease. The Bubonic Plague does still occur in some parts of the world today. But it did first attack the known world between 1346 and 1350. And during those 4 years, countries were competing for territory in Europe. England's King Edward III had just taken this country into the start of what became the 100 Years' War against France. That didn't end until 1453. The Black Death was the first truly global catastrophe, and it put a temporary end to these European squabbles. Black Death was a term not used at the time. It was named the Plague or the Great Pestilence by contemporaries. The label Black Death was ascribed well after the events, and there could be many reasons for that. The Latin word for it was pestis atra, while atra could be interpreted as dreadful, terrible, or black. And that's where the word Black Death may well have come from. What is the Black Death? It isn't actually a single disease. It's a cocktail of 3 related diseases: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic. The first 2 that I mentioned, the bubonic and the septicemic, were carried and spread by fleas. Third, as the name might suggest, the pneumonic plague was carried on the air. It was airborne and was spread by spittle and droplets on the breath, coughing and sneezing, in other words. The bubonic plague is obviously the best known and was the most common, sadly, but actually the the septicemic and pneumonic variants, although more rare, were more lethal, and death was far more rapid for the poor victims. So let's talk for a minute about the bubonic plague, the most common. The earliest symptoms were usually aching joints, and victims usually spoke about a sweet smell in their nostrils. And you'll see me make a very sad reference to that in my 4th video when we go to EAM. It was very much a summer disease and struck during the warmer months of the year for reasons that will become apparent. It caused headaches, nausea and vomiting. And famously and horrendously, the nodes in the groin, the neck and the armpits swelled to roughly the size of an egg. There was a rise in body temperature and the body was marked by dark blotches wherever it occurred. The person will become exhausted and apathetic. Horrendously, these buboes or swellings would make gurgling noises, and sometimes horrendously they would erupt. It's important to stress that this was an horrific and very unpleasant death for the victims. It degraded them and it traumatized all those who witnessed the horrible effects. It caused terrible pain, and death usually occurred between 4 and 5 days from contraction. If we move on to the pneumonic plague, this was one of the most infectious and fatal diseases ever known to humankind, and that remains the case. It's spread by droplets on the breath or saliva, as I say, coughing and sneezing being the obvious forms. And for that reason, it was far more common during the winter months. So if the bubonic didn't get you in the summer, the pneumonic might get you in the winter. It affected the lungs and caused sputum from the lungs and the mouth to become slimy, free-flowing and bloody. And death usually occurred within 2 to 3 days of contraction. Finally, we come to the most deadly but mercifully rarer form of the plague, the septicemic. This resulted from the direct entry of the plague bacteria or bacillus into the bloodstream by a flea. And we're talking here about a wound or a major cut. And if you think about the bodies of all the soldiers that were littering the European battlefields at that time, this was a perfect storm. Septicemic plague caused massive toxicity. And as you can see on some of the slides that I drop onto my Facebook page, the extremities of the body were hardened and blackened. Now, it was recorded that death usually occurred within a matter of 4 to 5 hours of contraction. I question, how did they know the moment of contraction? I think it is generally agreed, though, by those who are in the know, that this was indeed the most deadly form of all 3 plagues. So there's your 3 forms: bubonic, septicemic, pneumonic. Let's look at the bacterium or bacillus itself, the disease, the raw disease. The bacterium or bacillus was called Yersinia pestis. I'll drop a photograph onto my Facebook page so you can have a look at it magnified. It flourishes in the stomach of a flea with another glorious Latin name, Xenopsilla Chiopis. Xenopsilla Chiopis, this microscopic creature, too small for us to see clearly with our human eye, was capable of inflicting death upon millions. A remarkable fact. I'll show you a blown up photograph of this particular flea, the Xenopsilla Chiopis, and you'll see in there the outline of its stomach, which is extremely significant when we're talking about the plague. Now, it might surprise you to know that this was originally a disease that afflicted only rodents. Fleas fed on the blood of a host rodent, talk about that in a minute, and left the deadly bacillus in the rodent's body. The rodent would die, And there's all sorts of myths about the rodents being immune from it. They weren't. The rodent would die just as we would. But when it died, a healthy flea might feed on the blood of that dead or dying rodent, thus taking the bacillus into its own stomach. Now, unfortunately, this bacillus had the tendency and the feature of blocking the flea's gut and digestive system, wouldn't pass through. So, of course, its hunger was never satisfied or assuaged. And the flea, of course, would then go looking for another way of satisfying its endless appetite and ended up taking blood from another rodent. And thus, by regurgitating its lethal undigested meal into the body of that next rodent, the flea would perpetuate this continuum of flea to rodent to flea to rodent. Unfortunately, before long, there were insufficient rodents to satisfy the flea's lust for blood. So it would go looking for other sources, probably initially cattle, and then, of course, humans. Originally, it is thought that the flea fed on the blood of a species of squirrel native to the area covered today by Russia and China. That animal was the marmot, but before the 14th century, for the reasons that are unknown, certainly to me, the flea migrated from the marmot to the rodent that we're all familiar with, one that makes us shake and shudder, the black rat. It was the black rat which migrated from the Far East towards Europe, carrying with it its deadly cargo of parasitic fleas. So if you like to think of it, the rodent was simply the articulated truck. The real deadly creature in all of this was the flea, the microscopic fleas that it carried. The rat, the black rat, is of course a creature of nightmares. The World Health Organization once nominated the black rat as humankind's most dangerous enemy. It is certainly the world's most successful animal. It is a truly great survivor. It can search for food over enormous distances and can live for several days without water. It could gnaw through most materials, including lead. And here's the thing, it was able to climb ropes and leap over remarkable distances, which is very significant when you start to think about ships of the day. It was capable of these great feats, but the most significant thing about the creature was its amazing powers of reproduction, which really threatened humankind and to some extent still do. The black rat can produce litters of around 5 litters a year. Each of those 5 litters can include up to 15 young rats. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to work out that we're talking huge numbers here. Now, I am advised by scientists in the know here that in ideal circumstances, within a 3-year space, 2 rats in ideal circumstances can produce several million offspring. Now you start to see the threat. In this second video, I'm going to be looking at the trade routes which the black rat followed, bringing the deadly disease towards Europe. Because the black rat benefited from new trade between East and West. It lived comfortably in granaries and amongst livestock. And if we consider the European battlefields, part of the European wars, and the bodies of animals and humans that would have littered them, this was a perfect storm for the rats. Now that concludes the first video. In 15 minutes we've looked at the 3 types of plague: bubonic, septicemic, pneumonic. We've looked at the nature of the bacillus itself and its tendency to block the gut of the rat, which had this insatiable search for blood because of the nature of the bacillus. We've looked at the carrier of these fleas, the black rat. In the next video, I'm going to look at the source of the plague. How did it get from east to west? And that is a remarkable story in itself. I'll see you then.